Good morning. It's good to see everybody. You know, it's kind of a double blessing when you get to see everybody on Wednesday for fellowship time and time of Thanksgiving, and to hear people's hearts and what they're excited for, and also to reflect on the time of year where you also hear people's stories from time together with family, and it's interesting to hear about people's interactions with family and the things that really matter to them. It's always fun to hear that stuff, to connect with people. We often spend time, rightfully so, talking about the Lord and growing and learning in Him, but also recognizing that there's life outside of church that we are all part of. And it's good to hear stories and also be encouraged that each one of you, because I've known you for so long and so well, that who you are here is also who you are out there, and how those two things intersect is cool to hear and encouraging. I hope that my stories do the same for you. So, this morning, we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 8. But before we do that, I always want to just give a quick updates on how things are going at Phantom Ranch. And this fall was good. I'm trying to remember the last time I spoke earlier in Joshua, so it's probably been like a month or two ago. So, on the grand scale, not much has changed other than the seasons, which is always a bittersweet time of the year. Winter for me is time that is typically a little bit slower, partly because you can't do as much stuff because it's cold outside, but also because you can't get yourself too busy because you got to deal with snow. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. I don't particularly enjoy winter. It seems like that's sort of a general consensus amongst us all. I know Barbara said that she doesn't like the cold, so we're birds of a feather. And yet here we flock together in Wisconsin. I'm not sure why. But it was good. We had a good fall. We had a lot of groups that were coming. Our weekends were full, and there was a lot of people there. One group that I thought was kind of neat was, I know I told Dan this, we got a phone call from a group that initially went unnamed. Like, we would like to do a retreat. Our guy that deals with the churches and groups is like, okay, what's your budget? Like, we don't have one. It's like, okay, tell me a little bit more about your organization. As the conversation went on, it ended up being Pacific Garden Mission. Pacific Garden Mission wanted to bring people up, and we figured out between us and them and scholarship money that we had available towards the end of the year, like, I think we can make that work. So we hosted Pacific Garden Mission. They didn't come necessarily on what we would consider like a prime day. They came in the middle of the week, but the camp was there, it was available. They had need for what we could offer, and we could do it for them. So it was kind of neat to partner with them, and it was just kind of a small world. I know our church has been supporting Pacific Garden Mission and the Milwaukee Rescue Mission for as long as I can remember. And you guys have also been supporting Phantom Ranch, so indirectly, we're still supporting Pacific Garden Mission. It's just kind of cool to see all those things come together. As far as I know, they had a good time. I didn't end up interacting with them very much just because of the nature of the group, and what I do when people are there is, if I don't see the group, that's a win. Because if I am going and interacting with the group, it's because something is broken and we're trying to make their stay better. So thank you for your continued support of us in prayer and encouragement, financial support that the church has given for years to Phantom Ranch to continue to make that successful. It doesn't work without the people that support us, and you guys are all amongst those. All right, so with that, I'd like to go into chapter 8. There's interesting phrases that sometimes we'll hear thrown around. If at first you don't succeed, try again. That's one that people have many times have heard. The other one is to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is insanity. And at first, those two sayings, isolated from one another, both sound smart. But then you realize if you do the same thing and you try again, expecting something else to happen, you're going to fail. But also, if you never try again, you'll never succeed. And part of what I think breeds or brings about success is reflection. Reflection on how things went, what things went right, what things went wrong, and how can we do things differently. There was an interesting TED Talk I listened to a long time ago. It was a pilot for a B-2 bomber, those like boomerang planes. They're actually, ironically, stationed out of Missouri. So they fly out of Missouri in the middle of the country, and they basically leave for Missouri, do their missions, and come back to Missouri. They don't really land anywhere else. So they'll be out flying and they'll refuel in the air, and these missions can go on for hours. I mean, they can fly all the way to Africa, deliver ordnance, and fly back. And one of the things that the pilot said, he said, you get back, you're exhausted, you just want to go to bed because you've been flying for 30 hours. But the first thing they do when they touch ground is, after they get the plane secured, is they go to an after-action debriefing where they sit down and they talk about those exact same things. What went right, what went wrong, how can we do better? And he said it's an interesting time because it's a time where people sit down and it's not a time to like point fingers and say, you screwed up, you screwed up, you screwed up. It's not accountability. It's just a general overview of how did things go and how are we going to do better and what are we going to do from this mission are we going to do again. And as I was looking at chapter 8 is the do-over of chapter 7. Steve went through last week and sort of did the after-action report. They try to attack AI, obviously goes horribly wrong, and then there's some after-action debriefing as to why that was. God brings some things up, Cindy's talked about, things are rectified, and then they do it again. And the interesting part about this chapter is seeing the things that they learned from the last failure, how they changed those things, how they move forward into a much better plan that came from the result of failure. But also, there's a really cool thing that hopefully I'll have time to get to at the end of the chapter that I don't run out of time, where there's this reflection of how they actually got there. It's easy to say, well, they attacked AI and that's how they got there. But as we'll see as we get to it, there is a whole lot of history, specifically about this spot, that is repeated throughout the Bible. And this day that we're going to look at today was sort of written in the past and is being experienced now in the future by the Israelites. And I thought that was really cool as they're reflecting on sort of another after-action report, but instead of looking at the specifics perhaps of the battle, it's the overarching plan that God had. So with that, why don't we read through its entirety in Joshua chapter 8, and then we'll go through it a verse at a time, talk about some stuff, and answer some questions. One question I have, hopefully again I'll have time to get to, which I thought was kind of a hard question that needs to be grappled with. So, now the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given it into your hand, the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king just as you did to Jericho and its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves. Set an ambush for the city behind it. So Joshua rose with all the people of war to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 men, valiant warriors, and sent them out at night. He commanded them, saying, see, you are going to ambush the city from behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Then I and all the people with me will approach the city, and when they come out to meet us at first, we will flee before them. They will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say, they are fleeing before us as the first, so we will flee before them. And you shall arise, your ambush, and take possession of the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. Then it will be, when you have seized the city, you shall set the city on fire. You shall do it according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you. So Joshua sent them away, and they went to the place of ambush and remained between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. But Joshua spent the night among the people. Now Joshua rose early in the morning and mustered the people, and he went up with the elders of Israel before the people of Ai. Then all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near in front of the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between him and Ai, and he took about 5,000 men, and he set an ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. So they stationed the people, all the army that was on the north side of the city, and its rear guard on the west side of the city, and Joshua spent the night in the midst of the valley. It came about when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose up early and went out to meet Israel in battle, he and all the people at the appointed place before the desert plain. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Joshua and all the people pretended to be beaten before them, and they fled away into the wilderness. All the people that were in the city were called together to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. So not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who had not gone out after Israel, and they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand towards Ai, for it will give it into your hand." So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand towards the city. The man in ambush rose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it, and they quickly set the city on fire. Then the men of Ai turned back and looked. Behold, the smoke of the city ascended to the sky, and there was no place to flee this way or that, for the people who had been fleeing to the wilderness turned against the pursuers. When Joshua and all of Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city, and the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and slew the men of Ai. The others came from the city to encounter them, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. And they slew them until no one was left, those who survived or escaped. But they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. Now when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field in the wilderness, where they pursued them, and all of them were fallen by the edge of the sword until they were destroyed, then all Israel returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. All who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000 people in all in Ai. For Joshua did not withdraw his hand, which he had stretched out the javelin, until they were utterly destroyed, all the inhabitants. Israel took only the cattle and the spoils of the city as plunder for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. He hanged the king on a tree until evening, and the sun set. Joshua gave command, and they took his body down from the tree, and they threw it at the entrance of the city gate, and raised over it a heap of stones that stands to this day. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stone, on which no man has wielded an iron tool. They offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, and sacrificed peace offerings. He wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. All Israel with their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the strangers as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given command at first to bless the people of Israel. Then afterwards he read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. So you can see, if you remember from the things that Steve talked about last week, this was definitely a different result. But so was the plan. The plan was much, much different. The first part in the first verse, which apparently must have gotten cut off of my notes here, but it says, "Now the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear, be dismayed, take all the people of war with you, arise and go up to see Ai, given it into your hands." The first time that they went with a very small number of people. It's not recorded, at least in Joshua 7, that God gave them any sort of plan. It was just, he said, let's go up and spy on Ai. We don't need to take everybody, let's just go. And I think they were sort of stuck in the presumption of success that they had thus far, that, oh, we can do this, we'll just sort of do this on our own. And they went up there, and they were defeated. Now, they were defeated not merely because of presumption. I think there's a part of that might be true, but as we know from what Steve covered, it was because of the sin that was underlying and the people not being obedient and failing to yield to God's command the first time. And in verse 3 it says, Joshua rose with the people of war and went up to Ai, and he chose 30,000 valiant warriors and sent them out at night. And the first time he took 3,000. This time they decided to take 10 times that, to go and do the same thing, except those 30,000 are actually the ambushers. It was all the people of war, and these were the 30,000 choice people that were supposed to do the ambush, at least the way I understand it and the way that it is written. So you have an entire army of people, and then 30,000 of the strongest, 10 times the size of the force of the initial attackers, went to the backside, well, it was really to the one side of the city, kind of around the corner, to attack it. And the next, it says in verse 4, he commanded them, saying, see, you are going to ambush the city from behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Then I and the people who are with me will approach the city, and when they came out to meet us at first, they will flee before them. So the attack plan was completely different. First time they attack the city head on, people come out to defend themselves, and they run them off. And as we will see, as we continue on here, that the outcome ends up being quite different. And we'll talk about it more as we get there, but there's an interesting sort of humanity component that I was thinking about of what this must have been like as an experience as a citizen of Ai, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. They will come out after us until we are drawn them away from the city, and they will say, they are fleeing before us as at the first. So we will flee before them, and you shall arise with an ambush and take possession of the city. The Lord will deliver it into your hand. This is the other part that I think was missing in Joshua chapter 7. They said, we will go up and we'll take the city. And here we see Joshua telling them, the Lord will deliver it into your hand. You won't deliver it into your own hand. There is the victory coming from God is seen more, which is good, because you can see as we are doing an after-action reflection on these actions that they learned from their previous mistakes. What did we do wrong last time? Well, we sinned and screwed up, first of all. Second of all, we decided we were just going to do this on our own. And now we're going to recognize that we need God's blessing in order to have this victory. And then in the next verse, in verse 8, it says, Then it will be when you have seized the city that you shall set the city on fire. You shall do it according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you. I was thinking about some of those specifics. I mean, it's not hard to read what the commandment of the Lord was. And I think most of that stuff is in there. The only thing I think that was missing, and I don't know if Joshua included that, if there was a strategic reason, it doesn't say anything about setting it on fire. Now, he did say you're going to do this to Jericho, and they ended up burning Jericho also, but the timing wasn't quite there. Just thought that was an interesting side note. I think there's an opening, I think, for God's direction, and then Joshua to, in some ways, adapt that plan strategically to make it work. I think that if you just attack the city and all the people are outside of it, they would have no idea. Obviously, it says later, and we'll see it, they turn around and they see the city is on fire. That says something. There's no radios to say, hey, our city's under siege. There's no bells ringing. There's just smoke in the air as a signal to let them know that things have gone awry. In verse 9, it says, Joshua sent them away, and they went to the place of ambush and were made between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city, and Joshua spent the night among the people. So they divide their forces in the middle of the night, which I thought was interesting, but as I was reading, history talks about battles being fought in the dark and things being done in the dark, even into antiquity. It was if you listen to a lot of people soldiers that have fought in the war on terror for the last 20 years and now is over, that's one of the things they talk about, like one of the greatest advantages that America had is that they always say we own the night. Partly not because it's the technology, basically. If you have the capability to fly airplanes with night vision goggles, you can accomplish things in the dark, and you have a tremendous advantage over your enemy, which is seen here, them moving in the darkness. They didn't know that the city didn't know that they were being maneuvered on by a huge force. And I'm sure if they would have known that, they probably would have changed their thing, their choices going forward. Now Joshua rose early in the morning and mustered the people, and they went out with the elders of Israel before the people. Then all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near and arrived at the front of the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between him and Ai, and he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Ethel and Ai on the west side of the city. Now, I probably shouldn't go into this because I probably don't have enough time or enough understanding. There's a seeming mistake here. So you have 30,000 mentioned in the verses previous, and here you see that it says 5,000 men are set in ambush. A couple different commentaries addressed how this could be. Apparently that word for men can also be translated captain. So depending on how it's translated, it could just be 5,000 leaders of the 30,000, which if you think about it, kind of makes sense. If you have all these small divisions, that would be 6 people under each person's authority. It might make sense, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's that big of a deal. We see that in the end, that force, whether it was 30,000, 5,000, was more than enough to overwhelm the city and ultimately to win the battle. In verse 13 it says, they stationed the people in all the army that was on the north side of the city and its rear guard on the west side of the city, and Joshua spent the night in the midst of the valley. It came about when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose early and went out to meet Israel in battle, he and all his people at the appointed place before the desert plain, but he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Joshua and all of Israel pretended to be beaten before them, and they fled away from the wilderness. So if you're following this, you have a city, and then we'll just pretend that up is north. So you have a city, and they're attacking it from the north, but already you have this contingency moved around to the west side. So as they flee out to the north, the west guys come around, they sneak into the city, set it on fire, and then they go north to attack all these people. I only point that out not because I'm doubting your intelligence. I've just spent so much time reading and thinking about it. Sometimes when I first read through it, it was hard to visualize where are all these people moving and how is this all working. So that's more or less the battle plan. Now, there is something that I guess I was questioning and I was thinking about, is that deception was the commandment. Set an ambush for. Basically, lie to your enemy, and it will be a weakness for him, and it will ultimately be a result of the Lord, or a victory of the Lord. And I was thinking about that, in that God is telling them to use deception as a tool, which is a bit of a paradox when you think about it, because to lie and be deceptive is something that is talked against. And then I was thinking some more just about the concept of deception, to be able to be deceived, like I guess if you would call the trait of being deceivable, or being deceived, however you want to put that, the fact that humans can be deceived. We are vulnerable to deception. That's probably the way I put it. We're vulnerable to deception. I don't want to say it's uniquely human trait. You can trick a dog. So like humans and other animals share that. But I was thinking about that as a trait of mankind that has been a part of our nature from the beginning. If you think about the fall of Adam, if he was not, Adam and Eve, if Eve didn't have the capacity to be deceived, the serpent's words would have meant nothing. So we have this built-in weakness, if you will, in the ability to be deceived. And interestingly enough, that use of deception is not something that is unique to this story. I don't have time to go into in great detail, and I don't even remember where it is. It's somewhere in 2 Kings. There's a really odd passage where there's this meeting of the high council, and God asks who will go and deceive, and this guy, or who will go and basically screw this plan up, and then the one guy says, I'll go and I will whisper lies and deception, and then the Lord says, go and do it. So it is a weird, it's a weird thing to wrestle with, but at the same time, it's acceptable and it is used. And again, I'm not encouraging people to lie, because lying is not a part of that, or a commandment. But it is one of those things that when we see things like this, it is time to stop and to think about it. I don't know if I have any conclusions other than I guess I'll just raise the question. Perhaps just think about that. It is a weird paradox that is present in the nature of God and His holiness, and at the same time, ultimately this is a punishment and a judgment that comes, and one of those methods is through the defeat, which is through deception, which is interesting. So anyways, hopefully that's not too confusing and leads anybody astray, but these are the questions that when they come up, we have to be willing to ask them and consider them. In verse 16, it says, all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city, so that not a man was left in Ai and Bethel who had not gone out after Israel, and they left the city unguarded and pursued Israel. Now, as an unrelated but somewhat related thing, I guess I have a question for you to think about. What kind of a person are you? Are you the kind of person that just jumps in with both feet and the consequences be what they are? Or are you somebody that is more reserved and thinks about things? I will say And I think I was trying to figure out why do I gravitate towards this? And I think part of it is from my professional experience doing maintenance work. If you've ever worked on an old car, you'll have rusty bolts. And you can get on there with a wrench, and you can heave and you can hoe, and you can break stuff. But before I do that, I always stop and say to myself, if I break this off, what is my next step? How am I going to get back to this place? So I don't fully commit. I don't just, well, I got to get it off, and to consequences B, we'll figure it out then. I like to know what my consequences look like as I navigate decisions. And I think that line of thinking permeates into other parts of my life as I think about choices and risks and how I decide to do those things. And to be honest, there are people like me, and there are some people that just wholly commit. They will just do things that people like myself will be like, that's reckless. And at the same time, they often, when you mix us all together, Steve and I have talked about the balance that needs to be had in churches. If you think about churches, I'm sure there was, in the building of this building, there was probably people like myself who were like, well, let's be cautious and move one step at a time here to make sure we can step back, and other people were probably just like, full set, let's just do it. What happens if something goes wrong? We'll figure it out then. Why don't we figure it out now? But that tension of decision making is for the benefit of the body and the benefit of people. And I guess as an encouragement, if you are somebody who is more reserved and you want to take a step forward without lifting up your back foot so you can always come back, surround yourself perhaps with people that are willing to jump in with both feet. Because together, you will temper them from jumping off ledges that there's no way to get back up from. And they'll encourage you to do things that you may otherwise be scared to do, but that you will benefit from doing. Whether that be small risks in life, going on a vacation, starting a ministry. There's a lot of choices that have to be made in life, and I think there's a balance to be made in the reservation and the reckless. Perhaps people on the reckless side would probably use a different word to describe me, cowardly or whatever. If you're insulted by the idea of me calling people that just jump in with both feet reckless, I'd probably be insulted by whatever adjective they would use to describe me. But that's good. That's a good and healthy tension. And I wonder if perhaps, if they had known the risks, the people at AI had known the risks of an ambush, if they would have just said, well, we're going to send the full army, we'll defeat them, and then we'll deal with them also because we are the superior fighting force. But it didn't work out that way. And as I was thinking about the defeat of AI, was their defeat based on their pride in their past successes? Did they go out and fight the first time and they won? They're like, all right, well, it's going to be just like the last time. We're just going to do it again. Or was their defeat perhaps more of a foregone conclusion? We'll talk about that coming up here. Then the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand towards Ai, verse 18, for I will give it into your hand. So Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand towards the city. This idea of people stretching out their hands to victory is something that is seen several times in the Old Testament, specifically in Exodus. In Exodus 14, when the Israelites are fleeing from the Egyptians, God says, what are you doing? Stretch out your hand and command the sea to split. And that's what happens. And they all go across the sea in victory, and the Egyptians are swallowed up. And then perhaps this very thing was going through Joshua's mind when God commands him to do that. In Exodus 17, in verse 8, it says, the Amalekites came and fought against Israel and Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men from us and go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him, and he fought against the Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on each side of the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set, so Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. It's a weird story, but that's how it worked out. Why it was that Moses had to sit there with his hands up to be successful, I don't know. But that's how God ordained it, and that's how it worked. And as you can imagine, now Joshua leading these people after having been in battle himself, and now he's in charge, probably remembers this story. Maybe that's why he didn't need the stick or the rod. He's like, I know this works. It worked for Moses, it's going to work for me. And he decided just to do it. Perhaps it was Joshua who was younger than Moses. I don't know. Either way, he didn't seem to need the stick or somebody to help him. Or if they did, it wasn't mentioned. But I thought that was interesting because it seems like a little bit of an absurd tactic, but it has worked in the past. Then the men in ambush rose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hands, they ran into the city and captured it. They quickly set the city on fire. Now, it is interesting that he sent 30,000 valiant people to go and attack an empty city. But nonetheless, that's what happened. Perhaps he didn't know that everybody was going to flee. Perhaps he thought that the king would leave a reserve force in there and they would have to fight their way. But it didn't work out that way. And it seems as though that they were able to quickly overrun the city, and then they set it on fire. Which, as I said earlier, sent a very clear message to the people that were out fighting amongst the valley. We have a real problem. So when the men of Ai turned and looked back, the smoke of the city ascended in the sky, and they had no place to flee, this way or that, for the people who had been fleeing in the wilderness turned against their pursuers. So at this point, you're chasing people, you're full of confidence. This is it. We're going to beat them the same way we did last time. They're going to run away. If you stop and think about it from the city of Ai's perspective, they, I'm sure, had the same fear of Israel, or similar fear, that Jericho did. This dread of the people of Jehovah. And Jehovah's people come and they attack, and we repel them. We are victorious against them, which probably gave them a whole bunch of confidence. And then they're doing this again. Running out there like, we're going to do it, we're going to beat them again. And then everything's going really good until someone's like, hey, the city's on fire. What? And you turn back around, and now everybody you're chasing turn around and starts coming at you. You're like, uh-oh. Also, I don't know if the soldiers that were coming out to meet Israel were professional soldiers, if they were stationed and lived in Ai, or if they were just sent to Ai and they were professionals that were just living there as soldiers. Let's say they were the latter, and this is where they were citizens. This is where they had their earthly belongings, their families. So you're fighting out to battle, I'm going to save my city, only to find out that your city is burning, and everything you care about is burning. And now, you have to fight people that are coming at you, and then pretty soon, as we'll see before, you have all the people that are coming from behind you. I can only imagine on that day that confidence to just absolute dread and ultimately death that those people had to experience in this whole exchange between Israel and Ai. In verse 21 it says, when Joshua and all Israel saw that the men in ambush had captured the city and the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and slew the men of Ai. The others came out from the city to encounter them, so that they were trapped in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on the other side, and they slew them until there was no one left who survived or escaped. Once the other force joined in, it was over. As we just talked about, what a easy day to the end of days for these people. In verse 23 it says, but they took alive the king of Ai and brought him to Joshua. Now when Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness they pursued them, and all of them had fallen by the edge of the sword until they destroyed everybody. I'm just going to, for the sake of time, they killed everybody. And it says that, and then verse 26, for Joshua did not withdraw his hand, which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Real quick, it says he utterly destroyed. I looked at that because I was like, if he's holding up his javelin, he's not really fighting. I think that's probably meant to be understood as like sort of the man in charge is making the orders and then these things are happening, so his army is utterly destroying. And it's that, as I looked into the different translations, all sorts that seems to indicate that. Now, I only have 10 minutes left. And I have a difficult question that is raised in this chapter, not necessarily, I guess a little bit in my own mind, in my own heart, but I think it can be brought much bigger for people who are unbelievers. When we look at this chapter, and we look at what Israel just did, there's not really any way to get around the fact that they basically just ethnically cleansed an entire city. And you have the God that we often proclaim is this loving, gracious, kind God that loves you, and yet you have this. How do you reconcile these contrasting things? Because if somebody who was an unbeliever, he said, well, God loves you, and then they're like, what about Joshua 8? What about all the people of Ai? These are questions that we need to be able to answer. We need to be able to explain. I think there's a part of that question is raised because of a failing, if you will, of the church to teach on the totality of the character of God. We often, and rightfully so, we remember his grace, his love, his mercy, his redemption. We sing hymns about that almost every Sunday in the first meeting. We talk about that in the first meeting. We're called to remember that in the first meeting. But we often neglect to teach sort of the unsafeness, if you will, of God. I don't have time to go through all my notes because I really want to get to the last part. But there's a passage in Jeremiah, it's in Jeremiah 9. This is one that I basically have memorized and I constantly think about when these kind of questions are asked. It's Jeremiah 9:23. It says, "Thus says the Lord, not let a wise man boast of his wisdom, and not let the mighty man boast of his might, not let the rich man boast of his riches, but let him who boast of this, that he understands and he knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For I delight in these things, declares the Lord." The first one, I think everybody would agree on. God delights in loving kindness. But to say that God delights in justice and righteousness is equally true. These are not musings of people that are writing on behalf of the Lord. This is words straight out of the Lord's mouth. I delight in justice. I delight in righteousness. And I think that view of God is one that makes us understandably slightly uncomfortable, and one that is hard to proclaim and is not a popular thing to tell people. And I think when we think about the death of Christ, we will talk about it in a sense of love, that God loved you and that is why Christ died. But the whole truth is that you should have gotten that. You should have taken that on. Christ did it on your behalf out of love. And there's the idea that Christ died for my sin. That's true. But ultimately, Christ died to satisfy the righteousness of the Father, of which my sin was a problem. And it was fixed by that death. There's a holiness of God that demands death and destruction that makes us understandably uncomfortable. And it should. And part of that uncomfortableness is what draws us to the cross and recognition of the need of Christ and accepting that. And I think if you interact with people who raise that question, how do you worship a genocidal God? That genocide also was not without purpose. God needed to make a place. He needed to clean out a spot on this very dirty earth and say, this is going to be the place where I put my city on a hill for people to come to me. But I can't have people come to me amongst this utter filth that is. And we know from the history and reading the Bible from Genesis all the way to the end of Revelation that that plan did not work as it was supposed to. Israel kind of had its ups and downs and highs and lows as far as it worked for a little while and then it didn't. And we obviously, Judges is a time where it didn't work. And then you go through the end of the Kings, like during David and Solomon, things were going pretty well. The temple was there, people were coming, people were worshiping God. And then obviously that failed. And then as time went on, I think God, we know because we have seen the end of the story. At a certain point, God recognizes that this is a mess. I'm going to have to go down there myself and I'm going to have to fix this. And that's ultimately what he did. But to get rid of the people that were in the land wasn't just judgment and punishment. It was, I need my people not to be distracted by these people. These people are already worthy of death because the soul that sins dies. God said that in the very beginning. And this is just an outcome of their own mistakes and their own sins against God. And he's cleaning house for a reason. And I think we have to remind ourselves of that as we look at this and we struggle with it, but also encourage other people when they ask that question that this was not just for nothing. It's the beauty of God's plan is that it's never just for nothing. Now, that's all I have time for because I still got 5 minutes and I got a lot to go here. So I will leave it with that. So there are answers to those questions, and I think it is good to think through those things and be challenged by them and recognize that in the words of the beaver in C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan is not safe. God is not safe, and I think we should be careful to not get too comfortable just because we stand holy and righteous in the blood of Christ and somehow lack reverence for the holiness and the righteousness of God. There's a certain healthy fear I think we should have. And when we forget it, it is to our own turmoil. So, in verse 27, we see that there was a change in strategy. For Jericho, everything was the Lord's. Don't take anything. Everything is to be mine. And then here in verse 27, well, actually, for the first verses, God says you could take the plunders of the city. And I was thinking about that. Why? What was the change? If you remember back in Joshua chapter 5, the manna stopped. You have a group of people now that are eating the spoils of the land, but they're also no longer being cared for in a very direct way by God. God said, I'll bring you into the land and you'll have it. It's flowing with milk and honey. This land will sustain you. Well, now the land is sustaining them because they're there. So the manna has stopped, which gives reason why now you can start taking these things because this is yours. It's part of the land, which is part of your spoil, which is yours. So, the land, Ai is completely wiped out. Everybody's killed. It's a desolation forever. Heaps of rocks. It's probably an ugly, smelly, horrible scene. But it's done. And now we get into something that I don't have time to go through in its entirety because I wrote way too much stuff. But this area, this spot, this is not the first time that Israel has been in this spot. What's interesting is I was looking back through history, because it says in verse 30, then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, to God of Israel, in Mount Ebal. In Genesis 12, Abraham passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to an oak of Morah. Now the Canaanites were living in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar to the Lord, who appeared before him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain east of Bethel and pitched a tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. There was already an altar that had been constructed in this general vicinity at one point in the past. And here they are doing it again. And in Exodus 20, there is the specific directions on how to build the altar, which is why they don't use stone or tools, and they just need to be raw stones. And then in Deuteronomy 27, I don't have time to read all of it, but this is God declares in Deuteronomy 27 that this day is going to happen. There's a time where I'll just read it. So it says, so it shall be when you cross the Jordan, you shall set up on Mount Ebal these stones, and I am commanding you today, and you shall coat them with lime. Moreover, you shall build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield an iron tool on them. You shall build the altar to the Lord your God of uncut stones, and you shall offer on it burnt offerings to the Lord your God. And you shall sacrifice peace offerings and eat there and rejoice before the Lord your God. You shall write on the stones all the words of this law very distinctly. Then Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel, saying, be silent and listen, O Israel. This day you have become a people for the Lord your God. You shall therefore obey the Lord your God and do his commandment and his statutes which I command you today. This is almost like a premonition, if you will, of this day, this exact day in history. And these people, well, ironically, I don't remember at what point this verse happened, but there's a very good chance that many of the people that heard this particular verse didn't actually make it to the promised land, depending on where they fell in their screw up in the wilderness. But here they are, getting to be here and celebrate this victory in a very special way. And one of the ways that they celebrate it is by writing the word of the law and then reading it in the presence of all the people. For the sake of time, I think that as we think about this idea of writing it down, reading it out loud, is repeated in multiple places throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And as we talked about earlier, the human weakness of being able to be deceived, the safeguard against deception is to write things down, to be reminded of them, and to remember them. And one of the things that the Lord does is write down the word so that it can be read and repeated. It's when you cross the Jordan, pick up rocks, build these monuments so you don't forget. And when we forget things, we open ourselves up to being able to be deceived. And the importance of taking the time to read and remember, and not just once, but it seems to be this repeated thing. Like when Christ was talking about himself, the first meeting of church, do this as often as you eat in remembrance of me. Because people forget. And if we forget, we are deceived. We deceived, we fall. So I think there's something to be said and encouragement to follow in the footsteps here of writing things down and reading. And hopefully we are taking the time to do that in our own lives as well as we are doing it corporately here as a church as we read through Joshua and Judges and all these books that we've covered in the time that we have taken to study them. So, in the after action report, you can see that what went right was they had a plan that this time was from God. They executed it in a way that was honoring to him, followed the directions more closely this time. Everybody did, instead of just one guy screwing it up for everybody. We can see that God has a plan that goes beyond just the destruction of a single city. That was the other thing I was going to mention too, is I think people might, this is important, people might bring that claim of genocide against God, but if you remember that death and destruction, God is an equal opportunity judge. If you remember that the people that are here celebrating this day with Joshua, their grandparents or parents died in the wilderness. Why? Because they disobeyed. And that's not a unique thing. Like how many times do you see like the land opening up and priests getting swallowed up because they wanted to do things their own way? God is not a respecter of one group or another. He's a respecter of his holiness, and he expects you to do the same thing. And if you don't, you're done. And that is terrifying and also should be encouraging to us to know that a God that is so exacting can make us so perfect by the work that he accomplished. So, when we make choices and we do things, let's not be afraid to look back and to reflect on how it went and remember that, as I just said, I probably summed it up best, that our exacting God has made us perfect in his Son. And that as we look back on life's choices and the things that we try to do, whether they turn out good or bad, God is gracious and yet at the same time holy and terrifying. And I guess I'll just end on that. Let's pray quick. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time where we can look at your word and be challenged and encouraged by stories of people that in some respects experienced you differently. And yet, Lord, Lord, may you help us to always remember that you are the same holy and just God, and that we only stand in your presence because of your Son, Jesus Christ. May you help us to take the time to read from your word, to study, to be remembered, and be reminded of the truths, that we are not easily deceived and led astray. Just pray these things in your Son's holy precious name. Amen. Sorry I went over.